Would you ever vote for Klaus Schwab for Prime Minister and have the World Economic Forum take charge? That may sound like a stupid question, since most people think of Schwab as a buffoon or a Bond villain. Yet many political leaders in Europe are WEF supporters, and Mark Carney may win the election, bringing to Canada Schwab's radical agenda. This video is the third in a series looking at Schwab's books and how his ideas influence election issues. This video covers Schwab's book, Stakeholder Capitalism, while previous videos have covered the Fourth Industrial Revolution and COVID-19, the Great Reset. It's important to understand how radical these books are, since as we saw in the last video, the media isn't covering the downside of these ideas, and reporters who have never read the books accuse people of being conspiracy theorists for disagreeing with Schwab. I read these books, so you don't have to. And they are really badly written. Once again, the title is misleading, as Schwab's vision of stakeholder capitalism isn't really capitalism. These book titles are just catchphrases that Schwab can insert into speeches and WEF can sprinkle into their website articles. They give the people a false impression that Schwab is some kind of authority in industry, technology, healthcare, or capitalism. But unless you've read the books, you might not understand how shallow or misguided his concepts are. The books are dumpster fires of tangents and non sequiturs. In Stakeholder Capitalism, the first 6 chapters are just filler. Honestly, the reader can completely skip the first 146 pages without missing any of Schwab's thesis in the book. The concept isn't explained until chapter 8, and the only other relevant chapters are 7, people and the planet, 9, companies, and 10, communities. Early in the book, Schwab briefly explains a version of stakeholder capitalism. But in chapter 8, he says the earlier version is obsolete. In the earlier version, stakeholder capitalism was a system where businesses were concerned not just about owners and shareholders, but other stakeholders as well. Employees, customers, local communities, governments, suppliers. He writes that this was basically the system in Europe in the 1970s, when there was much more cooperation between managers and unions than in typical American capitalism. Sounds pretty good. But in chapter 8, Schwab says that model doesn't work, and now there are only 2 stakeholders, the people and the planet. So if you got bored reading because Schwab wasn't getting to the point and quit before chapter 8, you might think stakeholder capitalism is business with heart, when Schwab's version, as we will see, is more like eco-fascism. From the first 6 chapters, I'll only comment on 2 of Schwab's tangents. He makes brief references to the Club of Rome, a think tank that in the 1970s published limits to growth that said the world needed to dramatically reduce its population to avoid a disaster. Schwab praises the group, which shouldn't be surprising, since WEF meetings over the years have often featured speakers touting anti-human messages recommending massive depopulation. For the record, the Club of Rome was spectacularly wrong. Over 50 years, the population rose, but at the same time, food production increased, starvation and poverty decreased, and health and life expectancy improved. The other tangent I should mention is Schwab's brief suggestion that GDP stats are not important. Which is funny, since he spent the entire chapter giving the reader a detailed history of how those stats were compiled. Dissing GDP stats ties in with his comments in the Great Reset book about the tyranny of GDP growth and the goal of degrowth. Though he doesn't explicitly discuss degrowth in stakeholder capitalism, that is the result in practice. Germany is a good example. They closed nuclear plants providing cheap, reliable energy, spent hundreds of billions replacing that energy with unreliable wind and solar, and now have energy prices that are so high, German industries can't compete, and car makers and their employees are suffering. Definitely not capitalism. Same story in the United Kingdom, phasing out oil drilling in favor of wind and solar, with energy prices forcing business closures and the near total collapse of the steel industry. And Keir Starmer announced plans to take 10% of their farmland out of production. That's poverty, not capitalism. And the same fate awaits Canada if it elects Mark Carney, who wrote a book advising Canada to keep its resources in the ground to reach net zero targets. But let's get back to chapter 8 of the book. The 2 stakeholders are the people and the planet, and Schwab breaks down the people into 4 groups: government, civil society, companies, and international community. So notice how Schwab has made a switcheroo. His historic definition of stakeholder capitalism identified stakeholders of companies. Here, companies are stakeholders in something else. He doesn't really say what. So he breaks down civil society as unions, NGOs, schools, universities, action groups, religious organizations, and sports clubs. And the international community is UN, World Trade Organization, OECD, etc. So if you read the book to get a better idea how you could be a better capitalist running your plumbing business or family farm, you get up to page 178 and learn you're supposed to consult sports clubs and the UN. Those are your stakeholders. Universities are stakeholders, so radical professors can tell people how to live. But notice what's missing from the list. Taxpayers, business owners, shareholders, consumers. That's why energy prices are so high in countries pushing net zero that people have a hard time heating their homes in winter. This is not capitalism or democracy. Chapter 9 is supposed to cover business leaders who best exemplify stakeholder capitalism. The 3 CEOs highlighted are all members of the World Economic Forum's Board of Trustees. Which brings us to another essential concept. The book is not written to give you information, it is written to promote the WEF. Schwab's first hero, Jim Snabe, is praised for being the CEO of the software firm SAP, which in 2018 reached its goal of reducing its CO2 emissions by 50%. However, Snabe left the company in 2014. Badly written. Now, if Schwab really wanted businesses to reduce their carbon, he could have taught us how SAP reduced theirs, even without Snabe. But no, the book is not written to give you information. It is written to promote the WEF. So for all we know, they might have outsourced part of their business, so you have the same carbon footprint, but it's done at another company's office. Total virtue signaling. The second hero of Chapter 9 is Mark Benioff, CEO of Salesforce. Benioff literally opens Stakeholder Capitalism with a glowing review of the book on page Roman numeral 1, even before the title page. How did that happen? Hey Mark, I'm writing a book where I praise you in Chapter 9. I need you to write a glowing book review for it. Sure thing, Klaus.
Believe me, ladies and gentlemen, this man is a god.
As an aside, one of the other glowing book reviews at the beginning was by Mark Rutte. In the last video, Schwab was praising the European Green Deal for measures slashing food production. Mark Rutte was the Netherlands Prime Minister who was trying to kick the Dutch farmers off their land. Klaus has some interesting friends. As for Benioff, his Salesforce company sold software for people working from home. His network increased by billions during the lockdowns. And as you recall, Schwab supported all the lockdown measures. Funny how WEF promotes stuff that personally benefits WEF big shots. Chapter 9 gives a long story about Benioff supporting a proposition that would impose a 0.5% tax to help homeless people in San Francisco. But in the end, the homeless didn't get a cent out of it. Total virtue signaling. Schwab's third and ultimate champion of Chapter 9 is Larry Fink, founder and CEO of BlackRock, the largest private asset manager in the world. When you buy a BlackRock mutual fund, in theory you own shares in the underlying companies. But in practice, BlackRock has the voting rights for those shares. When the book came out, BlackRock was managing $11 trillion of other people's money, making Larry Fink the most powerful business elite on the planet. You see, rather than voting your shares in your best interest, he votes according to his own political philosophy. Larry Fink is the key guy in ESG scores. Environmental, social, governance. It's a system designed by WEF to evaluate companies and even countries. Fink makes money off this. He sells ESG funds to investors who are willing to pay more fees if they think ESG companies are morally superior. The ESG scores can be rather arbitrary, like Larry's private club. So while Schwab claims CO2 creates an existential threat to the environment, Tesla, the leader in zero-emission cars, wasn't even listed in Fink's ESG index, while one of the top 10 in the ESG ratings was ExxonMobil, perhaps the greatest fossil fuel producer in history. Complete hypocrisy. Exxon plays lip service to the ESG system. Elon Musk writes mean tweets. Not sure if ESG is a tribe or a cartel. Schwab doesn't elaborate much about the diversity and inclusion part of ESG, But in practice, these lead to some bizarre results, like Coca-Cola training its employees to be less white, or companies that have to take note of their employees' sex lives to ensure sufficient LGBT quotas for a good ESG score. In fact, ESG is antisocial, judging workers based on categories like race rather than by qualifications or how well they treat customers. And the governance part of ESG is a scam, as shown by the collapse of the Silicon Valley Bank and the bankruptcy of Sri Lanka, a country with a 98% ESG score. How can you have a good governance score and go bankrupt? In Chapter 9, Schwab praises Larry Fink for a letter to corporate execs in 2020, warning that Fink would punish them if they didn't push the official ESG agenda. That's a serious threat, because BlackRock already owns huge shareholdings in nearly every major corporation, sometimes even enough shares to get corporate execs sacked. By giving a bad ESG score to a company, Fink might be able to crash its stock price. So Fink, BlackRock, and WEF wield a lot of power by controlling ESG. Follow WEF's beliefs about politics and climate, or else. Fink even bragged about his ability to force his will on others. Behaviors are going to have to change. You have to force behaviors. And at BlackRock, we are forcing behavior. Sounds more like fascism than free enterprise. It's the same attitude expressed in the Fourth Industrial Revolution, where Schwab insists on a common narrative and wants to prevent a popular backlash. And of course, popular means regular people, and backlash means anyone with a different opinion. I think the ultimate goal of stakeholder capitalism is to make the World Economic Forum a stakeholder of every business. Now let's look at the planet as a stakeholder. Schwab explains. The planet pillar includes metrics on climate change, such as all the relevant greenhouse gas emissions, and plans to get them in line with Paris targets. So it's a cruel joke that Schwab lauded Fink as an outstanding example of stakeholder capitalism, when Larry was well known for flying his Gulfstream private jet around the world, even when attending World Economic Forum meetings to discuss carbon dioxide emissions. Gulfstream jets burn 450 gallons of fuel per hour, which is more than most car drivers burn in an entire year. Schwab further explains ESG. The people pillar includes metrics on diversity and inclusion, pay equality for each relevant group, women versus men, minor versus major ethnic groups, etc., wage level, the ratio of CEO compensation to median compensation. So how does Larry Fink's compensation match up with his idea of pay equality? $36 million. That's 1,270 times what his cafeteria workers make. So you see how much Schwab's books and the entire WEF are a gigantic grift. The Fourth Industrial Revolution advocates embracing new technologies. The Great Reset and Stakeholder Capitalism preach going gung-ho against carbon emissions. Yet Schwab refuses to run the WEF annual meeting by Zoom or live streaming, meaning that a large proportion of people arrive by private jet and helicopter, while the average Joe can't attend because of the $25,000 entry fee, in addition to the WEF membership fee that could run another $60,000. How's that for diversity and inclusion? And Schwab doesn't say anything about Fink's deals with the Chinese Communist Party. In 2021, BlackRock was the first company to be allowed to sell mutual funds in China. The company is financing construction in China, including Belt and Road Initiative projects. Fink touted China's greatness to American investors, publicly recommending Americans triple their holdings of Chinese investments. A bad timing, or those suckers would have invested just before the Chinese real estate collapse and huge drops in Chinese stock prices. So how does China stack up with ESG? Environment. China has the most CO2 emissions and continues to build 100 new coal-powered plants every year. Social. The Communist Party doesn't care for Klaus's people pillar with diversity and inclusion. Look at the atrocious way they treat the Uyghurs. Governance. Total lack of transparency, as the party runs propaganda against their citizens, blocks foreign social media, human rights violations. Yeah, Schwab usually gives China a total pass. So in the chapter where Schwab should be showing readers how companies can be better capitalists, who can help people and help the planet, all a reader sees hypocrisy, greed, and very unconvincing virtue signaling. After the book came out, another great Larry Fink moment was his letter to investors in 2022, lamenting that the Ukraine war marked the end of globalization as companies had to adjust to supply chains. Shame! Oh, but nothing about the hundreds of thousands of people who are going to get killed in the war. Not a problem though. Thinking the World Economic Forum made deals with Zelensky to make money from the reconstruction. Great insider trading opportunity when you know who will get the contracts. Never let a crisis go to waste. Canada's version of Larry Fink is Mark Carney, who funded the Glasgow Alliance for Net Zero, a loose cartel to put pressure on banks to fund net zero goals. He says every business decision should take into account carbon emissions, and Canada should keep its oil and gas in the ground. Yet, as head of Brookfield, his company was building new oil pipelines around the world, shipping Australian coal to China, whatever makes a buck. Chapter 10 is called Communities, and Schwab spends the first 6 pages discussing COVID response in New Zealand. Well, what's that got to do with capitalism? Well, Schwab was praising the Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, for her willingness to crash the economy with lockdowns. What Schwab calls stakeholder capitalism is not capitalism at all. A real capitalism involves private ownership and people running their own businesses. In Schwab's twisted system, politicians can be stakeholder capitalists even when shutting down people's businesses. Ardern actually closed down the entire country when New Zealand had exactly 1 COVID case. After the lockdowns, she followed Schwab's Great Reset strategy, switching focus from pandemic to an imagined weather crisis. She went to war with her country's farmers, who are the backbone of the New Zealand economy, instituting fertilizer restrictions and, incredibly, a cow burp tax to cut emissions from food production. The planet stakeholder gets priority over the people who need food to eat. The most tragic stakeholder capitalism story following the book was Sri Lanka, where President Rajapaksa banned chemical fertilizers, an ESG score of 98%. Crop yields plunged, the country couldn't feed itself, and had to import food from countries that did use fertilizer. They soon ran out of money to buy the imports, and the country declared bankruptcy. And despite this humanitarian disaster, Canada, New Zealand, the Netherlands, and other EU countries continued with anti-fertilizer policies. Now let's go to the middle of chapter 7. Schwab spends 4 pages talking about Ethiopia in great detail, particularly the city of Awassa, where he says only half the people have electricity and the most common vehicles are carts pulled by donkeys. Schwab laments that CO2 emissions in Ethiopia tripled from 2002 to 2017 as per capita GDP went from about 50 cents to almost $2 a day. And meanwhile, he says nothing about the thousands of coal-fired plants built in China in the same period. In fact, Schwab blames Ethiopians for any global warming we might get in the future. The same force that helps people escape from poverty and lead a decent life is the one that is destroying the livability of our planet for future generations. Schwab has lived 85 comfortable years in Europe. Piles of people visit him every year in their private jets. They burn tons of carbon a day. But he seems to have a problem that one day hardworking Africans might save up enough money to trade in their donkey for a moped. The hypocrisy is frightening. But why isn't the media also labeling Schwab as an anti-black racist? Chapter 7 begins and ends with quotes from 16-year-old Greta Thunberg. This is proof that stakeholder capitalism is not capitalism. Greta is a Marxist who wants to shut down entire industries. She despises private enterprise.
All you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth.
Greta claimed that the science was settled, but how could she judge the science? She hadn't even finished high school. She follows doomsters that have already been discredited. People say follow the science, but Schwab presents none. The chapter harps about CO2, but he doesn't quote any climate scientist to say exactly what the effects of CO2 will be or when they will be felt. Real information will lead to scrutiny, rational thought, debate, and nuance. That doesn't serve Schwab's plan. He profits from the blind faith in fear and doom. Schwab's message in Stakeholder Capitalism is that the entire world economy, governments, and institutions should reform themselves, reset, if you will, based on the ill-informed opinions of an angry Marxist teenager, even if that means laying off workers, throwing people into poverty, and starving millions.